right, let's dive right in. We're going back to the early days of World War II, a time when it seemed like the Japanese Empire was absolutely unstoppable as it swept across the Pacific. But in the middle of all that, one small group of soldiers refused to break. They became this lone symbol of resistance against a seemingly unbeatable force. You have to picture it. Japan was taking everything. The Dutch East Indies, Singapore, you name it. But in the Philippines, this small group of American and Filipino soldiers just wouldn't give in. They were cut off, they were outgunned, they had next to no supplies, and yet somehow they managed to hand the invaders a shocking defeat in February of '42. They became a real thorn in the side of the Japanese war machine. And the man leading this defiant stand, the one and only General Douglas MacArthur? Back home, he was a massive hero for this. But as the Japanese grip got tighter and tighter, President Roosevelt ordered him out. He had to evacuate to Australia, leaving his army behind. And when he got there, he made a promise that would go down in history. 3 simple words for the men he'd left to their fate. So MacArthur makes his famous promise, but what about the guys still on the ground? What happened to the 78,000 soldiers he left behind on the Bataan Peninsula? Well, their story is one of unbelievable bravery that tragically spirals into one of the worst horrors of the entire war. Okay, so let's get a feel for the situation in early 1942. The Bataan Peninsula was basically a powder keg. It was a stalemate, sure, but a fragile one that was just waiting to explode. And this is what's so wild, the contrast between the two armies. On one side, you've got the defenders. Their morale sky high after that first victory, but their bodies were literally wasting away from hunger and sickness. And on the other side, you have the Japanese, who were humiliated by that early loss, but were now getting massive reinforcements and were absolutely determined to get their revenge. For the defenders, things were getting more desperate every single day. The Japanese had a blockade that was like a stranglehold. Nothing was getting in. Rations were cut in half. It got so bad they had to slaughter the cavalry's horses for food. And on top of the starvation, diseases like malaria and dysentery were just tearing through the ranks. They were completely, totally on their own. So let's talk about the guys in charge, because the choices they were about to make would decide the fate of every single man on Bataan. And for the Americans, the whole command structure was about to get thrown into total chaos. So with MacArthur gone, all that pressure falls onto General Wainwright. But the guy who would really face the storm was Major General Edward King. Think about it. He was now in command of what was basically a ghost army. 78,000 starving, sick men, staring down a fresh, reinforced, and furious enemy. And just for context, all of this was officially under the command of USFA. But really, with MacArthur on the other side of the world in Australia, the men on Bataan were fighting their own war, completely cut off from the top brass. With his army now full of fresh troops and heavy artillery, the Japanese commander, General Homa, knew it was time to strike. And he came up with a plan, a brutal, efficient plan to just shatter the American lines and end this resistance once and for all. Homa's plan was devastatingly simple. He was going to focus all his power on one single weak point in the Allied line, right around a place called Mount Samat. First, he'd unleash a terrifying artillery and air bombardment to just obliterate the defenders. Then his infantry would pour right through the gap, driving south to the sea, splitting the peninsula in two and trapping the defenders in a pincer. And what happened on April 3rd was, well, it was apocalyptic. The Japanese unleashed a firestorm. For 6 straight hours, over 60 tons of bombs fell from the sky, turning the American and Filipino positions into an absolute hellscape. It didn't just break their lines, it broke their will to fight. Under that kind of pressure, the Allied line didn't just bend. It didn't just break. It completely shattered. The defense of Bataan, which had been this symbol of defiance for months, just crumbled. And it happened so fast. And this timeline just shows you how fast everything went south. Right after that bombardment, the Japanese just pushed forward easily. The Allies tried a desperate counterattack on April 6th, but it was a total disaster. By April 8th, the entire defensive line was gone. It was just chaos. The battle was over. It was lost. In the middle of all this chaos, General King gets an order from MacArthur all the way from Australia. The order? Attack. It was insane. It was impossible. King was on the ground, and he saw the reality. He saw his men, starving, sick, being slaughtered. With 70,000 lives hanging in the balance, he made the agonizing choice to defy MacArthur's order. He decided to surrender. And so, at noon on April 9th, it finally happened. Japanese tanks rolled right up to General King's headquarters, and they were met by white flags. After months of heroic fighting, the battle for Bataan was officially over. But for the 78,000 men who put down their weapons, the end of the fighting was not the end of the suffering, not even close. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of absolute horror. In the days that followed, the prisoners were forced on a brutal march north. We don't know the exact numbers, but the estimates are just staggering. Something like 2,300 Americans and nearly 10,000 Filipinos died on that march. From exhaustion, from dehydration, from unspeakable cruelty. Their bodies just left on the side of the road. You know, as he was surrendering, General King pleaded with the Japanese commander, Major General Nagano. He just asked him to treat his men humanely. Nagano's response is one of the most chilling things you'll ever hear. He said, "The Imperial Japanese Army are not barbarians," a promise that was about to be broken in the most brutal way imaginable. Because what came next was the Bataan Death March. It was a literal descent into hell. These prisoners, already half dead, were robbed of anything they had left. They were denied food, denied even a sip of water, and forced to march for days in the blistering tropical sun. And if anyone stumbled or fell, if they couldn't keep going, they were beaten or just bayoneted on the spot. It was a complete rejection of every single rule of war. The fall of Bataan was technically a victory for Japan, sure, but it's a victory that's forever stained by this atrocity. And it forces us, even today, to ask a really tough question. When the basic rules of humanity are broken, what is a victory even worth?